Awesome. Recording in progress. That's what it says. And will it be? I hope it does. Hope it records this. Hope I don't lose it. Well, anyway, so this is a new series that we're going to do. I'm going to show you some things I come across that may not appear in articles themselves during my research in a little side series. This is the first of them. And I'm currently researching a load of really interesting people in a really interesting time and this long line of events. And the people who are involved in that long line of events, really interesting people. And in doing so, I came across this fantastically intriguing article from the New York Times, The Grey Lady, in about 1978 or 1979, I think 1979. So, background to how I come across this isn't directly probably related to the article that I was actually researching, but I was looking and hunting down a film production company called Xanadu Productions. Now, Xanadu Productions was set up in 1959 by Ivor Bryce and a guy called McClory, and these guys were instrumental in creating the first James Bond to an extent, and trying to create a production studio that was based in the Bahamas that could help with filming James Bond and other things. Of course, they actually produced a few different flicks, I would say, through this production company. Well, in 1959, one of the men, Ivor Bryce, knew Ian Fleming, the guy who created James Bond, really well. When they were young, during World War One, people had sent their kids to countryside resorts and seaside resorts and stuff, to the countryside and to seasides in Britain to avoid Zeppelin attacks. So Zeppelins, those big balloons, would come over and drop bombs randomly, sporadically over London. And this was, of course, lots of fear. So a lot of rich people sent their kids down to these expensive little resorts that they had set up. It was a kind of a early version of what happened in World War II. And Ivor Bryce went to Cornwall, and there he met on a beach a young boy, Ivor Bryce. He met Ian Fleming, and they formed a lifelong friendship, went to Eton together. They're both from high up families, obviously. They're going to Eton together back then. And by World War II, they're both working in intelligence. Ivor Bryce is actually recorded as being the only British recruit for the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, and probably was CIA himself. He was also MI5, MI6, and during the war, mainly BSC, which was a unit based out of New York, but basically dealt with trying to sour relationships between Americans and people Americans were close by feeding disinformation and things like Ivor Bryce was to make it look like Cuba could be taken over by the Nazis and was a central focus for the Nazis, so that the Americans would concentrate on Cuba and stop the Soviets getting in there. So it was like forcing the Allies' hands. That's what they were doing at the time. Don't ask me why. These guys do crazy things, but they do. And so these guys were doing really interesting stuff. And after the war, they continued to do interesting stuff. Ivor Bryce is related to someone I was researching, and this is how I came across this article that we're going to look at today. So the person I was researching is George Huntington Hartford II, and his sister was Josephine Huntington Hartford. Also, her married name is Josephine Bryce. She married Ivor Bryce. And George Huntington Hartford II was the grandson of George Huntington Hartford I. He was the man who invented the concept of chain grocery stores. So this was like A&P, the biggest like start to chain groceries, and the concept was created by this man who became incredibly rich, but he hated one of his sons, Edward Huntington Hartford, who was, of course, the kids of Josephine and George, who was the father of Josephine and George. So because he hated his son, George Huntington Hartford had his will skip over him, and when he died in the 20s, that all that money, I think it was in the 20s, all that money went to his son and his grandson and his granddaughter, Josephine and George. However, you know, George was a bit of a philanderer and an idiot, and Josephine was very clever, became a racehorse owner, very successful in her own right, and she would marry Ivor Bryce. And by 1959, they were living in the Bahamas in a villa called Xanadu, hence where Xanadu Productions come from. And McClory, who worked on the first James Bond, and another James Bond later, I think his name's Kevin McClory, went to this villa one night when visiting the Bahamas, and they agreed that they could develop on this project. They got other people involved. I think a guy called Ernest Cuneo, who was also like, he's one of the granddaddies of the spy world. He was BSC as well during the war, and he, along with Ian Fleming and others. Ian Fleming was actually pushed into writing movies for James Bond. He had written the book, I think, in 1952, the first James Bond book, and it like been really well received, been really successful, and he was kind of pushed into it. And he didn't want to. His letters go backwards and forwards. So it's like, I don't really want to do this, and they're going, no, you got to do this. By 1964, Fleming was dead. I think it was 1964. He died. By 1963, Xanadu Productions, the people involved in Xanadu Productions, were in court fighting against each other for who has the rights to this or who has the rights to that. It didn't work very well. Ivor Bryce and McClory didn't get on very well, and it all broke down. The idea was to invest in a production company in the Bahamas, and McClory had convinced Fleming to write James Bond, as being in the Bahamas through one of the books, so that they could do this and this could work out. Unfortunately, they both hated each other by the end of their experiences, and they were both fighting against each other. So they had little to do with the James Bond project afterwards. And Xanadu Productions probably didn't last past 1964 with this group, or was bought off by someone else. Not quite sure. They produced a Western TV series after their troubles in court, like the production company. So it was obviously still running for some time. Who was involved in that and who actually was at the head, I do not know. So I just don't know who was running the production company at the end. But in 1979, there's still a Xanadu Productions making films. So when I'm researching for Xanadu Productions, I find Xanadu Productions still making films. Now, this could be a completely new entity, Xanadu Productions. This could be the company was taken over by other people. So I don't know if it relates. And it is just a side note about all those very interesting people who created Xanadu Productions to an extent. You can read more about them in the near future when I finally publish loads of stuff I've been working on recently, some really interesting stuff. For the time being, we're going to read this article that I found that I think is really interesting. Put it down there. And it's in the New York Times on Wednesday, August the 9th, 1978. And this has one of the strangest last lines. I mean, the whole thing is pretty much intriguing. So, actors in movie on child sex say they are unpaid. Unwrap that one. Actors in movie on child sex say they're unpaid. So what, slave children who are working on a child sex movie? I'm not sure what's going on. So was really interested when I saw that headline, and it was somehow to do with Xanadu Productions. So I read on. Greenfield, Massachusetts, August the 8th, Associated Press. A trial of unpaid actors and creditors, a trail, sorry, of unpaid actors and creditors is all that remains of a company that began filming a movie about child sex on location in Franklin County earlier this year, according to Greenfield Recorder. Now, Franklin County, I don't think is the same place where the Franklin scandal took place. I think this is a different Franklin, but still interesting that the name Franklin comes up. Officials of Xanadu Productions, which has been filming Morning, Winter, and Night, are reportedly in Canada trying to raise money to complete the film. It features 13-year-old Brooke Shields, star of the recent Pretty Baby. She is directed by Cliff Robertson. Miss Shields was paid in full before filming began. Mr. Robertson and others say they have not. Actors Guild to sue. John Suick of the Screen Actors Guild in New York said the guild would sue Xanadu on behalf of its members for salaries, pensions, and welfare payments. I'm pretty grim about the prospect of getting it back. He added that Xanadu owed money to Bon Bon Productions, a New York company that acted as a paymaster and auditing company for the producers. The crew the producers assembled shot about 20 minutes of film while in Franklin County, according to Eric Albertson, a film editor who said he'd been paid in full. Cost estimated at $2 million. Now get ready for a really crazy end line. He estimated production costs at $2 million and said a lot of people were hurt along the line. The Recorder reported that although the producers were aiming for a PG, parental guidance suggested rating, the movie featured scenes with children engaged in sexual intercourse. Now, let me read that last line to you again so you can understand. The Recorder reported that although the producers were aiming for a PG, parental guidance suggested PG rating, the movie featured scenes with children engaged in sexual intercourse. Now, the story, the film is based on a book of the same name, I believe, and that's about a 13-year-old coming of age drama about a boy who's 13 who has two girlfriends who are 11. He has his first sexual experience with them. That seems a little bit strange. Why? I mean, why would that be something that adult? The 70s was full of adults being creating movies and pushing forward movies that made children turn children into kind of like adults, like like Jodie Foster in Bugsy Malone, or in Taxi Driver. There's a lot of examples. The year before, they mention a movie in this article, saying that it features 13-year-old Brooke Shields, star of the recent Pretty Baby. Pretty Baby had been out the year before this article came out, and Pretty Baby, where Brooke Shields plays an 11-year-old prostitute. That's what they call it. Of course, some people nowadays would say, well, that's just an abused child. It's not a prostitute, is it? You're just calling it a prostitute. And that kind of is what this era is like. It's she would, in just a few years' time, so this is in 1970, when she's like, she must be what, like 15 or something, when she has a full frontal in 1980, when she's starring in Blue Lagoon, which was very famous. She was naked in there, and it was very controversial at the time, if I remember correctly. And I was very young, so I didn't understand why I knew. And like now, I don't understand why I knew, but I did know. And what was this about this sexualizing Brooke Shields when she was young? Because there was a lot of it. She was in multiple. She was like a sex icon from when she was about 11 years old. It's bizarre. Why is that something that it was normal within our society? But anyway, officials of Xanadu Productions has been filming Morning, Winter, and Night, and this is what it was called. Yeah, if you go, let's go. Let's come out of there. Let's say, oh look, it's all very yellow, isn't it? Let's go over here to look at two things. So this is the pages. Let's go to the IMDb. So First of all, you've got Pretty Baby. Pretty Baby was in 1978. This is the year before this other movie is being made. And Brooke Shields plays what is described a teenage, lives as a prostitute. Well, does she live as a prostitute or is she abused by a load of men? But anyway, so Susan Sarandon's in this, and Keith Carradine. What's interesting, really interesting, is the writers of this, Polly Platt and Louis Mal. Yeah, Louis Mal. But that's the movie that Brooke Shield had made the previous year to this other one, and was about her being what they describe as a child prostitute. So that's pretty hard. It's pretty strange that she would be in so many movies that include child sex when she's a child. Well, no, this seems to be something they liked about her very early on. From when she was about 11, 12, they were starting to see her as a sex icon. And this is something that we saw a lot in the 70s and we continue to see. So Alice, Sweet Alice was one of her first movies when she must have been about 9 years old. That seems a little bit like, there's lots of talk about Alice in Wonderland and the like. Pretty Baby, of course, there, but there's no mention of this movie that she was filming the year after that had seems to have disappeared. So they spent $2 million on it, and it went nowhere. It's very interesting that this time in Britain, what you saw was pedophiles thinking that and pederasts thinking they were entering into the mainstream. Laws had been changed in the late 60s on homosexuality. That made a load of people back then think, oh, that means that we're going to be able to molest children soon legally. And so they all went out to try and do such things. So you have seen more projects like this and more sexualization of children. And then you saw organizations in Britain, such as PI, the Paedophile Information Exchange, where they used to exchange information about paedophilia with each other. And of course, there's a lot of abuse that goes through that time that seemed systematic and establishment based. And of course, one of the biggest establishments is that of the film industry, which gets access to kids in a way that not many other industries do, where adults are left alone without their parents around to look after these children. And Brooke Shields was someone who was completely noted as a sexual entity from before she was a teenager, and that's a bit bizarre. So that's a real interesting article there that is, I think, worth noting and was worth noting. So I'm going to do this more often. I'm going to find articles here and there that are of great interest, and I'm going to say, come have a look at this, and then we can have a little exploration of it. So if anybody can work out whether that's the same Xanadu Productions as the one set up by Ivor Bryce and McClory back in 1959, that would be amazing. So that people don't realize, or when they're investigating, what's the big find? What's the big find? Well, in this story, that is a big find. In the story of, and it's a bigger, wider story. That is quite a big find. So go out and do it. This is me, Johnny Vedmore and Funky Monkey, exploring articles, exploring the archives. I don't know what I'm going to call it yet. It'll be in the title, so you'll know. I don't.
What we know is that we will end up with many more unemployed